Muy buenos días a todos. Pues sean bienvenidos al inicio de esta reunión titulada como una mesa de diálogo. Tenemos como invitados especiales a dos estudiantes, un estudiante graduado y otro estudiante no graduado de la Universidad de Notre Dame, cuyo tema central de ellos es el tema de la migración. Son alumnos del doctor Jorge Bustamante. Él desde hace muchos años tiene una distinción especial, una cátedra especial en la Universidad de Notre Dame, y para nosotros ha sido muy provechoso este vínculo a lo largo de muchos años, que ha permitido que estudiantes del Colef y otros colaboradores, también investigadores, participen de esta relación de colaboración con la Universidad de Notre Dame. Pues la idea de este diálogo es precisamente acercar a estos dos estudiantes a la presentación de sus proyectos, a la discusión de algo que seguramente les interesará a ustedes. Por desgracia, nosotros estudiantes están todavía de vacaciones de alguna manera y no tendríamos a tantos estudiantes como hubiera sido nuestro propósito en esta ocasión. Sin embargo, algunos sí se contactaron de los estudiantes de Colef y la idea es que participen, así como otros colegas, en esta reunión de diálogo. Es una reunión muy abierta. La idea es que estos estudiantes invitados presenten a ustedes sus ideas, entreguen un diálogo con ustedes, participen de una manera pues amplia, exactamente en preguntas, y insistir un poco del tema también en el cual el Colef ha puesto mucho interés en el asunto del tema de los Dreamers. El año pasado tuvimos una especial atención con una escuela que recibió a cerca de 20 Dreamers, la mayoría de ellos mujeres, en un reto muy importante. Era la primera vez que venían a México a conocer a sus familiares, fueron a ver a sus abuelos, a sus familiares más cercanos, y después de esta experiencia de visitar a sus familiares, estuvieron aquí por espacio de 2 semanas en una reunión muy interesante, porque pues era la primera vez que estos jóvenes universitarios de distintas partes de los Estados Unidos, les decía de ustedes, la mayoría de ellos mujeres, decidían salir de los Estados Unidos. Gracias a la autorización del Departamento de Estado, los estudiantes pudieron regresar tranquilamente, pero desde luego fue un reto para ellos muy fuerte el salir de sus casas y emprender algo que era un sueño que se hizo realidad cuando pudieron ir a visitar a sus familiares, a estas partes. Esto es el inicio, pero el año pasado también, ahí a inicios de diciembre, nosotros seguíamos escuchando mucho el tema de los Dreamers, el reto que para México tendría, y hicimos una reunión bastante grande para dimensionar en el campo del trabajo, la salud y la educación, el reto que México tendría si algo pasara con el programa Dreamers. Desde luego, desde estimar cuáles son sus capacidades y cualidades de estos miles de jóvenes, casi 1 millón, y qué son los retos que México tendría para recibirlos. Aparte de esta reunión, hicimos una reunión más focal para atender el tema que los centros públicos de investigación tendrían para recibir, para hacer compatibles los estudios que estos chicos tienen en los Estados Unidos. Entonces fue un ejercicio muy interesante que nos llevó al tercer día de la reunión. Estamos trabajando en la elaboración de un proyecto, un documental, sobre explicar al público mexicano qué son los Dreamers de manera más amplia. Es un proyecto que estamos trabajando con el profesor Armando de Cal State, y bueno, pues darles a ustedes nuevamente la bienvenida, agradecer al doctor Jorge Bustamante que hubiera tenido este interés de que los estudiantes que hoy nos visitan pudieran tener este diálogo, y pues sean ustedes bienvenidos al Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, doctor Hernández, por su presencia y para dar inicio a las actividades que están enmarcadas desde una manera formal en este convenio que mencionó el doctor Hernández entre el Colegio de la Frontera Norte y la Universidad de Notre Dame a través del Instituto Kellog de Estudios Internacionales. Y entonces tendremos estas dos presentaciones. La primera va a estar a cargo de Juliana Tiscareño y entonces le doy la palabra. Adelante, Juliana.
Good morning, buenos días. Today I'll be reading my paper that I wrote for Professor Bustamante's class, A History of the Migrations of My Grandparents. Throughout this class, I have come to a deep understanding of the words vulnerability and resilience, and what they mean to the plight of immigrants, and by extension, the history of my own family's migration to the United States, how they navigated working in the United States, and how their perceptions of their relationships with Americans and status in this country was shaped. In 1973, my grandfather, Aurelio, married my grandmother, Eloisa, in the small town of Tzintzuntzan, Michoacan. There were many people against this marriage, as it had been previously decided that they each would marry someone else, and the two were not of same social status. There was such bad sentiment directed to the new couple that it became too dangerous to stay, and they were warned that she would die if they did not flee the region. They decided to migrate to Tijuana, Mexico. Upon arriving to Tijuana with not more than the clothes on their back, my grandfather, an experienced wood craftsman with a passion for the fruit of the land, started his own fruit cart business with a fruit cart he made from discarded wood he found behind a warehouse. And this one fruit cart soon turned to 5, and he was soon running a profitable business. In 1975, my grandparents had their first child, Orlando, and then my mother, Zoila, just 1 year later in 1976. In the year 1980, after the birth of their third child, Carlos, they made the decision to cross the border into the United States, a ganar dólares, to make money, every penny of which they would dedicate to saving to fund the construction of their own house that they eventually began in 1984 in Tijuana. They began to cross over frequently with the pasaporte local, a document that allowed them to cross the border into San Diego, but not to legally work. Having heard of work through compañeros, or those who had previously crossed and passed along the information that there was work, they started seeking work in the United States. They started working in La Pizca, following the temporadas or picking seasons, following the crops from oranges in California to the cherries in Oregon and the apples in Washington, for 6 months at a time, always mailing their documents back to Mexico, so as to not be caught carrying a document showing that he or she had violated the terms of, in case they were caught by La Migra, or immigration officials. Massey describes this portrayal of network theory in action, where my grandfather and his compañeros had a shared community origin of Tijuana, Mexico, that allowed them to pass along knowledge of foreign employment opportunities, lessening the risk of crossing and not being able to find employment. This dynamic theory accepts the view of international migration as an individual or household decision process. Upon entering the United States, they became foreigners, with less legal rights and protection of basic human rights than U.S.-born nationals, as defined by the Constitution of the United States. They would illegally contract with the people in charge of the crops to fill crates of whatever fruit they were picking, and earning $25 between the two of them for the day, which was seen as good money at that time for this work. Of course, they had no opportunity to negotiate this price, even if they had wanted to, lest they got questioned about their legal status or threatened with deportation by the white Americans in charge. The notion of Gemeinsinn by Max Weber, as it is applied to the phenomenon of Mexican immigration by Jorge Bustamante, allows for the analysis of the dynamics of this employer-employee, simultaneously foreigner-national social relationship. Each party, actor, and contractor came to the work relationship already sharing a Gemeinsinn of a cultural understanding that dictated how each party would be allowed to behave. Informed by previous relationships and information from compañeros, it was completely understood that the employer would set the price, and the worker, my grandfather, would either accept the stated price and work exactly how the employer wished or go seek work elsewhere. In this situation, the vulnerability of my grandfather, who, as the proud man he is, would be quick to deny that he has any vulnerabilities whatsoever, this imposed vulnerability began as soon as he crossed the border to look for work. His status as a foreigner, as an immigrant, and as a person of color immediately created a state of vulnerability imposed on him by the power structure of the US government, recognizing him as a non-national and thus a person with less rights than the documented American citizen. Once he accepted and entered into an illegal employee contract with the American employer, he accepted a position of inferiority that was imposed by entering into this specific type of social relationship, where the employer had the freedom and the protected power to pay substandard wages, call immigration at any time, and violate basic human rights. All of the above without ramifications from the United States government, because my grandfather, as a non-national, had not guaranteed protection of even the most basic human rights once on US soil. This is in direct opposition to the rules set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and agreed upon by countries including the United States. My grandparents traveled back and forth from the US to Tijuana to make money in La Pizca every 6 months for the 4 years between 1981 to 1984, having their first American-born daughter, Irma, in Washington in the year 1984. In 1986, under the Reagan administration, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, aka the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, created the opportunity to a path to legalization for a certain group of immigrants. My grandparents applied for this opportunity with the proof in the form of pay stubs that they had lived in the United States in the year 1982. They were instructed to go to the United States and stay there for 6 months. And so they left their children behind yet again, now numbering 5 children: Orlando at 11, Zoila at 10, Carlos at 6, Irma at 2, and newly born Consuelo at just 3 months. Their applications were approved, and in 1986 they crossed from Mexico to California at La Garita de Otay International Border. My grandparents' journey of migration perfectly illustrates the observation of circularity of migrants as proposed by Jorge Bustamante, an observation that shows migrants do cross the border with plans to return back to their country of origin, never intending to make America their new home. This idea of circularity of migrants is one that is not widely known to the masses, as it contradicts the typical and most prevalent in the media narrative of immigration, which is that families come to seek what they understand as the American dream and set roots in the United States. When I posed the question to my grandparents of why they had come and when they decided to stay, I had the idea that their story followed the typical one and was just seeking confirmation of such a common narrative. However, this was not the case, and it was a startle to hear that they had never actually intended to relocate permanently to the United States. My grandparents had first migrated from Michoacan to Tijuana as a matter of safety of their lives. And after having 5 children in 7 years, they decided to make the international migration to the United States to make money to support the family and provide access to the United States for their children. They were quickly able to cross the border legally with the pasaporte local, although they would be seeking work illegally, creating expectations for work relationships based on the experiences of their compañeros, all for the opportunity to make American money. They routinely returned to Tijuana having no intention of seeking the American dream. Even after they had gone through the process of achieving legal status for themselves and eventually their children, they had plans to return to live happily in their home that they built in Tijuana. When asked directly had they planned to stay, my grandmother replied with a laugh and said, "Para nada," or not at all. Their purpose was merely to make money and have their children become bilingual, and once these 2 purposes were filled, then return to settle in Tijuana. This is why my grandfather had dedicated all of his earned money and spare time to not only building and renting out properties in Tijuana, but building his family a 3-story house with a room for each of his children. He was a wood craftsman and built most of the furniture himself, and I particularly remember the beautifully crafted long table with matching chairs that still sits in the dining room. Today, up on the screen, you can see the living room, and that was built entirely by my grandfather and his family. My grandparents ultimately decided to stay in the United States and continue to work once their children started setting roots, having partnerships and children of their own. When asked about how they were treated and if they had at any time been discriminated against because of their legal status, the color of their skin, or the fact that they spoke only Spanish and some broken English, my grandmother said that until this day, she has never experienced discrimination. Gracias a Dios, thanks be to God that the Americans were always muy amables, or very kind. This was not the answer that I was expecting, and I was very confused by her response. It seemed to me impossible that in the 36 years she has been traveling throughout the United States that she has not experienced discrimination. However, it is through the education that I have received that I am aware of all the different types of discrimination and know that overt racism is only one of the many ways in which discrimination can occur. Yet not even experiencing overt racism did not seem quite plausible to me. I have spent years learning about and getting frustrated at the systems of oppression that exist to depress any form of minority in the United States, especially Mexican immigrants. In this class, we not only learned about the presence of these systems, but the why structures that support them, which of course all leads back to power differentials. It is these very power differentials that has allowed for the groups in charge to shape the dialogue surrounding immigration. The oppressing groups have cultivated the idea that the disadvantaged should be grateful for what they get, that everyone can get ahead by working hard enough, which is simply a way to justify their exploiting the cheap labor of migrants. And this is what allows hardworking immigrants, such as my grandparents and many others, to truly believe that they have never been discriminated against. In a discussion about this with my mother, she clarified that above anything else, my grandparents feel grateful for the opportunity they had to come to the United States and make money. Their idea and understanding of the conditions that they would endure were formed long before they would actually cross the border, when they were being told what it would be like by those who had already experienced life as an immigrant in the United States. Discrimination was not seen as a violation of rights, rather a necessary part of working illegally in the United States. I was able to evaluate and come to a frustrated understanding of this by going back to the notion of culture and community. My grandparents belonged to a multitude of communities, and their understanding of life in the United States was formed by the Mexican immigrant community. We defined community in one of the first classes as a group of individuals with the same culture and understanding of the particulars of that culture. In this instance, the culture and community are defined as the Mexican seeking work in the United States. Field work and picking fruit became a niche job for the Mexican immigrant, as Mexicans gained the reputation of being the hardest working group of laborers, which contributed to the lessening of risk of not finding employment upon crossing the border, as an understanding came to be between the Mexican immigrant community and American fieldwork employers that the Mexican immigrants would be preferred for the jobs. Within the immigrant community itself, which consists of both documented and undocumented individuals alike, there manifested a strong understanding, as they were all driven by virtually the same reasons to cross the border. When factoring in all the risks that were understood, such as being caught, deported, or even dying trying to cross the more dangerous ways of crossing the border illegally, and the slim chance of getting approved for work if coming in the legal way, it is not surprising to realize that once having crossed the border and obtaining a job, these individuals felt extremely grateful to have come that far in the process, thanking God for allowing them to even get that far. This led to a warped view of the employer in the United States, not as an American national taking advantage of an abundant supply of cheap labor by paying immigrants less than a fair wage, as is the reality, but as a not-to-be-questioned, benevolent employer willing to pay for labor without asking questions about legal status. Laborers who got this far had the mindset of being grateful for the opportunity to be earning American money and had no thoughts concerning whether they were making a fair wage or if their rights were being violated. This is what led to the confusing answer by my grandmother that the Americans who employed them were very nice, because she interpreted any action that allowed them to make money as such a gift, because as an immigrant without proper documentation at that time, this was never guaranteed and viewed as something to be grateful for above anything else when it did occur. When my grandparents became immigrants, they accepted the vulnerabilities that came with the status as a foreigner in the United States. They accepted that position of inferiority and operated for so long with that identity, never recognizing injustices for what they were because they felt they did not have the right to complain, only the duty to work hard to achieve their goals and surmount any obstacles the best they could, never questioning why those obstacles were there in the first place, exhibiting the resilience that allowed them to achieve the level of success that they have. This is the journey of my grandparents throughout the years. After achieving permanent resident status in 1986, my grandparents would work in a series of warehouse positions, eventually settling in Whittier and then Hacienda Heights, California, having 2 more US-born children, Karina and Aurelio Jr. My grandfather is no longer employed due to health reasons. Yet, my grandparents both wake up at 4 a.m., 5 days out of the week, to take my grandmother to the bus depot, where she will take 3 different buses to get to work, the same routine she has been doing for the past 12 years. She earns an hourly wage of $13.50, with 3 years left to retirement. After everything, my grandparents are above all grateful for their opportunities and hardships both, and would today say that they have achieved the American dream that they were not even looking for, having bought a house in Riverside, California 5 years ago, where they are able to plant as many fruit trees as they want, and having their first grandchild attend college, the prestigious University of Notre Dame. Having become aware of and examining the underlying forces of such phenomena as racism, ethnic relations, nationalism, and immigration through these readings and in-class discussions has been extremely engaging and thought-provoking, especially as a citizen in this current political climate in the United States, and as a granddaughter and daughter of immigrants. Immigration has become an issue that I was familiar with through a general knowledge of my family history, to the forefront topic of conversation everywhere in society today, as a result of Trump's focus on depicting Mexican immigrants as criminals and rapists, in efforts to arouse support for his building a wall across the Mexico-US border, and his action on the demise of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. Such rhetoric and actions have caused mostly everyone to come up with an opinion on immigrants, whether it be the xenophobic-driven act of building a physical, largely ineffective wall, or the realization of support for young dreamers' opportunities to continue to build their lives in the society that they grew up in. As informed by a personal knowledge of family migration and material such as the emotional film Which Way Home, which follows the journey of a group of migrant children, it is astonishing to me that the prevailing view of immigrants is that they simply come to steal jobs. 14-year-old Kevin in the film Which Way Home did not ride the beast, the train, risking his life once on a journey with only a friend and then again by himself to steal an American's job. Rather, he was fleeing his home city that boasts one of the highest homicide rates in the world. My grandparents were not in the pursuit of stealing jobs. Rather, there existed an understanding between U.S. crop employers and the Mexican immigrant community that there was a niche job of picking fruit that was not being filled by Americans, and my grandparents took the job to gain money with the goal of eventually returning home to Tijuana. The current dialogue surrounding immigrants is plagued by xenophobia, which is an intense or irrational dislike or fear of people from other countries. This message needs to be spread, and policy needs to change to reflect and accurately respond to the real reasons behind immigration, which are community violence, instability in other countries, and a willing market that profits off of the cheap labor of immigrants, all the while selling them the American dream. As long as these realities exist, no physical barrier will work to stem immigration, and when coupled with current rhetoric of immigrants, racism and discrimination will only flourish. As depicted in Jorge Bustamante's dialectic of the vulnerability of the international migrant, there can be no true equal treatment until there is policy in place that does not discriminate between foreigners and nationals, because this classification that assigns rights to one and not the other is in direct opposition to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that the United States has signed, but the protections of which our government's policies still directly conflict. Some of these protections include Article 2, ban on discrimination, Article 6, right to recognition as a person before the law, Article 7, equality before the law, and Article 13, right to freedom of movement. There needs to be comprehensive policy protecting all of immigrants' rights. This will include no wall and extending the deferred action for childhood arrivals while adding an assured path to legal status, also protecting the parents, what is known as the Clean Dream Act. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al doctor Hernández por su presencia. Entendemos sus múltiples actividades que más que me hacen agradecer su presencia. Y quiero solamente comentar del trabajo de Juliana, que creo que es una reflexión muy elocuente respecto de lo que representa la migración en términos generacionales, siendo ella hija y nieta de migrantes, y de cómo esos sentimientos pueden prestarse a confusión sobre, desde luego, las causas reales, estructurales, en que son discriminados los migrantes, pero que paradójicamente son vistas como una oportunidad y representan en términos reales una oportunidad cuando se comparan las oportunidades de trabajo en Estados Unidos con aquellas en México. Y esto, la manera en cómo lo presenta Juliana con intercambios con su experiencia personal, hace de este trabajo una expresión que es útil para el entendimiento de este fenómeno tan complejo. Quiero mencionar que Juliana está tomando un tiempo apenas para empacar, porque mañana sale para Italia becada como estudiante de Notre Dame, y pues esto hace que ha sido un valor agregado a esta reunión que mucho le agradezco. Gracias, Juliana.
Muchas gracias.
Y damos continuación ahora con otro trabajo de un estudiante muy particular de los que yo he tenido en Notre Dame, porque además ha resultado ser un líder de los estudiantes. Él es el presidente de la Asociación de Estudiantes Latinos en la Universidad de Notre Dame, que cada vez es un número más importante, y ciertamente pues tienen una representación que es un reflejo de la apertura que hace la Universidad de Notre Dame, que a diferencia de otras universidades en Estados Unidos no es atendida por estudiantes locales, sino por estudiantes en realidad no solamente de todo Estados Unidos, sino de varios países de América Latina y aún de Europa. Y esta diversidad del estudiantado de Notre Dame pues agrega experiencias al hecho de ser una universidad en la que a veces no les ha hecho mucha gracia un comentario que yo he hecho de que en Notre Dame somos más famosos por lo que hacemos con los pies que por lo que hacemos con la cabeza, pero esto no parece haber sido compartido con el sentido del humor de muchos. Bueno, ahora quiero dar la palabra para este estudiante que va a presentar el segundo trabajo, Gregory Jean, que en el caso de estos dos estudiantes, no solamente sus papers los seleccioné porque se trata de dos muy buenos trabajos, sino porque que merecen publicación, sino porque ambos viven muy cerca de aquí de Tijuana. Y Greg, su familia vive en San Diego y Juliana también. Entonces esto facilitó su presencia pues de un grupo mayor. Adelante, Greg.
Excuse me. Well, first and foremost, good morning, buenos días. I would like to firstly thank Professor Bustamante for not only serving as a professor for Juliana, myself, and the Latino community on campus, but for serving as a mentor for us and always being willing to offer your support in any capacity. You have truly been a professor that a lot of students can rely their trust in and have been a person that has really affected my life and influenced my research. And I owe a lot of my success to you, Professor, and would like to thank you for all of the work that you've done for not only the students at Notre Dame and for here at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, but for the Latino community in the United States, and especially the migrant community.
Gracias, Greg.
I would also like to thank my family for coming, especially my tía Dora and my mom, who have always given me their support and are really the inspiration for a lot of the research that I have done and have always given me the support that I've needed to continue on and attend the University of Notre Dame. So firstly, my presentation is on the political atmosphere of the United States currently. It's actually kind of picking off a little bit what Juliana was saying about the political climate. Actually, when everything was really happening with the election this past year in 2016, a big, massive change really happened. Something personal, but also within the country itself. Something that I had always understood was that the United States was built by immigrants. It was a nation in which peoples from all over the world, from the Far East, from Asia, from Europe, from Latin America, really came together and constructed what we know today as the United States. And that is something that I was taught in schools and something that I took a lot of pride in because both of my parents are were immigrants. My mother was born here in Tijuana. My father was born in England. So both of my parents came to the United States and were able to create a life for themselves that not only bettered their own lives, but also bettered the United States. And I could say that not only about my own parents, but my own family, and also the Latino community and any community that has come to the United States searching for a better life, or as Juliana was saying, just coming to the United States, not even expecting to find the American dream, and yet finding it nonetheless. But with the 2016 election, there was a bombshell for me. There was two narratives that were proposed. One was that of what I just mentioned, that immigrants really helped create the United States that we know today and further helped the nation and the world. The second was that immigrants were destroying the country, that they were rapists, that they were miss housekeeping, that they deserved to be thrown out of the country and a wall be built, that they were lazy, that all of these horrible stereotypes that were being brought out. And yet, that's the side that won the 2016 election. So for me, it was something that really struck me and caught me by surprise. And so in taking the course with Professor Bustamante, I really wanted to investigate the political ramifications of this election and also look at the history of the political cycles of the United States. So to begin, with the 2016 election, it's important to note that 2.8 million more Americans voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. So first and foremost, he lost the popular vote. He lost the overwhelming amount of Americans that support him. And if you look at his ratings right now as the president, they're abysmal. Furthermore, the one thing that did facilitate his win is there's a big contrast in the United States right now that a lot of the urban areas, so if you look at California, New York, Illinois, Chicago, these are areas where there is a conglomeration of people. It's a big urban center, and so therefore they are seeing and witnessing that migrants, that peoples from all over the world are contributing to a better community. Yet, at the same time, you see with a lot of the Republican states, they tend to be more rural, they tend to be less welcoming towards migrants, and so therefore have been able to continue with the with the race baiting, fear mongering, scapegoating, given that there's not as many migrants to those areas and it's a lot more rural. And because the way the United States functions, in that in order to become president, you must win the Electoral College. That is why Donald Trump was able to win, despite having 2.8 million more Americans vote against him. So one thing that I wanted to do was actually trace the Latino involvement in the United States, both in terms of migration to the United States and also political incorporation and political participation. To begin, with Latinos currently in 2016, they are growing as the largest minority group in the United States. Obviously, Latino is very broad, and that'll get into the complexities of what it actually means to be a Latino in the United States. But nonetheless, if you take the term Latino in its broadest sense, they are the largest group. And with the 2016 election, you can see that because of this massive shift of demographics within the United States, there has been a strong reaction by the white populace, by those that tend to stick towards nativist roots. And you can see that with the election of Donald Trump and his campaign. So the thesis of my argument was, through reviewing a short history of Latino political history and political involvement, analysis of the outcome of the 2016 election and the future of Hispanic election cycles, this paper attempts to understand the future political implications of the Trump presidency and Latinos, among other minorities, and how that will shape the landscape of the United States. So to begin, a little bit of history. Obviously, this is what we would know as the New World in terms of Europe discovering, quote unquote, America. So the Spanish were actually here first, and within the settlements that the Spanish set up, Latinos, if you want to make that term out of the Spaniards that came and the areas where the Spanish controlled, were actually in the demographics of the United States prior to the actual United States itself. So if you look at Florida, if you look at Texas, if you look at California, Latinos were actually there first, prior to the arrival of Anglos from the United States. And Professor Matovina of the University of Notre Dame actually documents this in several of his books, talking about the first settlement of European origin within the United States being St. Augustine, Florida. And you can see that Spanish-speaking Catholics, Latinos, have been in the United States almost twice as long as the rest of the population of the U.S., of Caucasians in the United States. Obviously, that history would change with the Mexican-American War. The United States waged war based on the doctrine of manifest destiny to essentially steal lands from Mexico, thereby taking California, Texas, Nevada, and pretty much the entire western part of the continent. And so in this respect, you can actually see that the border hopped over these peoples rather than these peoples hopping the border. So there's a little bit of it's a little bit inversed in this regard, which is one thing that I think is really crucial to highlight in speaking about the Latino community in the United States. Obviously, this is not to say that all Latinos are descended from those original settlers and pioneers, but nonetheless, there is a presence in the United States prior to others. Therefore, not every Latino is an immigrant. Obviously, in recent decades, there has been a very large increase of Latinos to the United States, and there's several factors that explain this phenomenon: economics, political revolutions, social unrest. But the most important of these factors was, as highlighted in Juliana's presentation, was cheap labor, and highlighted in a lot of the readings that we did with Professor Bustamante, talking about how migration of Latinos is largely linked to the demand of labor during periods of economic growth. And during economic growth, Latinos are more than welcome. The United States and the sentiments of Americans are more than happy to take Latinos. But yet in times of crisis, in times of economic depression, in times where the economy seems to be slowing, the first people that tend to be blamed are Latinos, the people that had been actually helping to stimulate the economy. And if you look at the history of Latinos as opposed to the other European or Asian immigrants coming to the United States, if you look at Titchener's book, there's a book written on the political incorporation of migrants in the United States. Latinos were deemed returnable because of their close proximity to the United States and the ease in which Latinos themselves were actually returning to the US, referring to the circularity of migration. So now to discuss a little bit of the political involvement of Latinos. So therefore, and then I can attempt to make a little bit of a prediction of what the Donald Trump presidency will actually mean for the United States. So to begin, the League of United Latin American Citizens was formed in 1929, and El Congreso de Pueblos que Hablan Español was founded roughly at the same time. So prior to this, there were Latino efforts to mobilize politically, but none were actually on a national scale or basis. A lot of the efforts were mostly regional or community-based, which obviously is wonderful in and of itself, but in order to enact major policy proposals or changes, you need to have national mobilization. So the formation of LULAC and also El Congreso were two huge monumental milestones for the Latino community within the United States. Despite the differences that these two organizations had, for instance, LULAC only conducted their meetings in English and they restricted membership to only those with citizenship. And El Congreso, on the other hand, was technically more Latino in that it incorporated more Latinos of a variety of backgrounds. LULAC had a lot of Mexican Americans, whereas El Congreso was more Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans. It incorporated a lot more of a variety of Latinos. But despite the differences that these two organizations possessed, they laid a foundation for political activism of the Latino community that we would see later on in the 1960s. And with the 1960s, this is when we get to the politics of protest. And I find it very fitting that we're here in California, Baja California, but also in California, as opposed to Notre Dame, Indiana, where it's a little bit there's a little bit of a distance between where these events occurred. But in the 1960s, we see a major leap forward for the Latino community in terms of the United Farm Workers movement in California. And we can see this with Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta. We see this with the major political leaders that are, for the first time, really making lasting change for the Latino community. Obviously, there were changes made with LULAC and with El Congreso, but this was the era of civil rights. This was the era where communities of color, communities that had been discriminated against, could make a claim and make a voice for themselves and have political incorporation and participation. And because of the vulnerability and the cycle of poverty that existed in California farms, the enormous agricultural businesses had been exploiting these vulnerabilities of the Latino migrants, specifically migrants in the farms, so farm workers. But Cesar Chavez famously organized these workers to mobilize in this time period. At the same time, we know that the Bracero program was formed during World War II, and it continued on after, essentially into the 1960s. But the United Farm Workers movement was actually crucial in terms of trying to get more rights designated towards these workers, trying to get more protections and facilitating a manner in which these migrants could express the vulnerabilities that they are experiencing on the farms. Within 15 years, more than 50,000 farm workers were protected by union contracts based on the UFW. Finally, and this is something that I thought was absolutely fascinating, coming from the University of Notre Dame, which is obviously very Catholic in and of itself, it was very interesting to research this. A huge reason why Latinos were able to get involved politically in this early period was because of John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic president. And at the same time, obviously a lot of the Latinos within the United States were Catholic as well. So this facilitated a religious as well as ethnic motivation for mobilization. And so Hispanic Catholicism was utilized in well-publicized masses, notably the 1968 California primary campaign of Robert Kennedy to spread the movement. And Mexican Americans were crucial for President Kennedy to win Texas in his major win for the presidential election. It was through his strategy of targeting Latino voters that facilitated his win, but at the same time was able to mobilize a huge portion of Latinos, thereby making them giving them a political voice and allowing them to vote. Perfect. At the same time, in the 1960s, we see the establishment of MALDEF and NCLR, which is the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the National Council of La Raza. But obviously, the National Council of La Raza has changed their name recently to the Latinos Unidos because of, well, there's a variety of reasons, but one thing being in raza means something completely different in English as opposed to Spanish. So race. So in Spanish, obviously, it refers to the people, but in the United States, which is heavily dominated by the English language, it has an implication of race, so therefore they wanted to change their name. Anyway, continuing on, this allowed Latino activist organizations to form clinics, social services, agencies, training programs to further integrate Latinos into American culture and society, and to improve the prospects of jobs and of civic participation and engagement. And in fact, in this time period, several universities were forming Chicano studies programs. Further, in the 1970s, this is when we see the work of union and legalization rights. Unfortunately, in the 1980s is when that movement begins to fragment. And that's when we see the term Chicano be characterized as a radical leftist, as very essentially radical, as somebody that was on the far fringes of the political spectrum. And at the same time, this is when we see the Census Bureau use for the first time Hispanic, referring to those that speak Spanish. And in Chicago and later in California, this is when the term Latino began to become widely spread and well known. And then thereby also facilitating people to refer to themselves by their origin. For instance, Mexican American or Cuban American, Puerto Rican, etc. And as discussed in Juliana's presentation, IRCA happens in the 1980s, 1984, which is the 1986, which is the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And what's crucial is this was a bipartisan agreement instituted under a Republican administration to provide amnesty and provisions for formerly undocumented immigrants to become eligible for citizenship and incorporation into the United States, thereby allowing themselves to be citizens, but also crucially their children, and also allowing them to have the right to vote. One thing about IRCA was, and I'm focusing in on California as a prediction for what I believe will happen in the United States in the current political spectrum, or in the current political atmosphere. So in 1994, there was a backlash to IRCA in specifically California, a state that had voted for the Democrat Bill Clinton, passed Prop 187. Now, for instance, I wasn't born in 1994, so I wasn't alive back then. So for other members of the audience, you may remember what IRCA is, but for those that don't, I'll actually be explaining what Prop 187 was. So it was enacted essentially because of the overwhelming white vote in its favor, despite major objections of the Latino community, Asian American community, and Black community. So what was Prop 187? Prop 187 essentially barred undocumented immigrants from public education, so they couldn't go to kindergarten through college. It required all publicly paid non-emergency health services to verify legal status before providing any services. It required all persons to verify legal status before receiving cash assistance or other benefits. And it required all service providers to report suspected undocumented migrants, required that the police determine the legal status of persons arrested, and made the use of false documents a state felony. So simply by being undocumented, you were already becoming a felon based on that last point there. So with this California politics in mind, one thing that we should keep in mind was that even today, but specifically talking about 1994 and before and after this event, the Latino vote has always been relatively low. Latinos don't tend to vote in comparison to their white counterparts, in comparison to the African American community. And so this was utilized essentially by Pete Wilson in his run for the governor of California. And with Prop 187, that was a banner in which he characterized his run. It was a major point that he characterized Latinos as immigrants. And you can see this with his actual political ads. And if you see some of these here, support continuing state services to illegal immigrants, Wilson sending more guard troops to the border. He was characterizing all Latinos as illegals, as people that did not deserve to be within California, and that were the problem for a lot of California's problems. And so there was the famous ad that he ran, which kept saying, "They just keep coming. They just keep coming." It was extremely offensive, and for him, it actually worked. It actually helped the Republican Party in California at the time not only win the election for Pete Wilson, but the Republican Party made huge and historic gains within the state legislature. And you can see right here just how pervasive the win was for Republicans. Democrats were running with their tails behind themselves because the Republicans just swept the elections. In the gubernatorial election in 1994, the Republican Party, Pete Wilson, won 55.2% to 40.6%. And so with this majority in the state assembly for the first time, the Republicans were swept to power in California and were able to focus in on their policy of alienation of Latinos, marking them as the outsider, as the other. But there was a strong reaction against this. And I kind of think this is a very funny quote for me, that Latinos are Republicans. It's like roaches for raid. And you can really see this quote enacted with this political run of Pete Wilson. There was a huge outrage and an increase of Latinos showing up to the polls after. Through this alienation tactic of the Republican Party, through appealing to white conservatives, specifically older white conservatives, in 1996, Bill Clinton carried the Latino vote 71% to 20%, and the Hispanic Latino turnout increased over 12 percentage points. This was a huge win and set a standard that we can see today with California politics. Democrats have a supermajority of the state legislature. They also have they are also the governor. Jerry Brown is a Democrat. We can see Democrats hugely dominate most of California. Obviously, there are still pockets of where Republicans tend to win, such as Orange County or some of the more rural districts, but overwhelmingly California is and will continue to be a Democratic state. And so with this political involvement of the Latino community, the Republican tactic only served for a short-term basis. They were able to win definitely initially. They won with huge strides. And you can kind of see where I'm going with this. You can see huge strides made today within the House of Representatives and within the presidency of Trump. But the long-term effects of alienating Latinos backfired for the Republican tactic. It actually helped facilitate California to further become a Democratic state. The Republicans essentially overplayed their hand by turning against the Latino vote. And so if you look at the political involvement, in 1998, the Latino vote increased 14%, with a total of 78% going for the Democrat Gray Davis. And in 2000, California Latinos voted for Al Gore over George W. Bush, 68% to 29%. In 2014, the Latino community was 39% of California's population. And because of the years of demonization by the Republicans, firmly cemented these Latinos on the side of the Democrats. Obviously, there is variation within the Latino community of who identifies as a Democrat or a conservative, but overwhelmingly, there tends to be an association with the Democratic Party, which I'll explain why in a moment. So with this clarification I do want to make is that there can be, for instance, Latino Republicans. There can, they exist. And I'm not trying to oversimplify the Latino vote or the Hispanic vote, because there is a diversity of Latinos, and we can obviously see that with the huge landmass and diversity of Latin America. But my argument is that despite the status and class differences that may exist within the community of Latinos within the United States, Latino ethnic groups do share a common heritage and share many social priorities. And actually, in doing my research, I was able to come across some of these. For instance, Latinos tend to oppose same-sex unions or marriages and abortion, which tends to come from the Catholic heritage of Latin America. But at the same time, Latinos in the United States do tend to support civil rights, higher taxation, government-provided social benefits, etc. And these views are very consistent with the Hispanic culture's value of collective over individual goals, which is a huge characteristic of the United States. Very self-individualistic, self-oriented, I'm doing it for myself kind of idea in terms of getting goals done and accomplished, whereas the Latino community is looking more at the collective, what is for the common good of our community, of those that I associate myself with. So if we look at Latino interests in the country overall, a driving force behind the Latino community has been their growing numbers, number one, and the growing understanding through education that their own children's futures rely specifically on the protections given by civil rights and also on publicly funded social services such as education. Because obviously not everybody can go to a private school that exist in the United States. Public education is huge in providing means for those of low socioeconomic status to better themselves, better their lives, and also better the country. And with the increased inclusion and integration of Latinos in the country, there's an increased phenomenon of awareness behind this. Obviously, there are barriers that I do want to state that do exist for the Latino community that aren't necessarily a characteristic only of Latinos, because the African American community also suffers from these barriers as well. But nonetheless, this is a huge barrier for the Latino community, which are voter ID laws, which tend to be voted and supported by Republicans, and also just very low turnout rates at elections. This is something that is just really undermines the national presence and infrastructure of Latinos. So in 2013, the Supreme Court invalidated key parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, thereby permitting 9 states, mostly southern states, to institute changes to their election laws without federal approval. Therefore, Texas moved very quickly to start instituting voter ID laws that had previously been blocked, because they know that this tends to go against African Americans and Latinos, who tend to vote for the Democrats. So proponents of these laws, as I stated before, tend to be Republican and claim that they are maintaining the integrity of the electoral system by eliminating voter fraud. And this is something that Professor Bustamante constantly tries to state in our classes and impress upon us. Before you make a claim, you always have to make sure you have factual basis and empirical evidence. This is something that in Professor Bustamante's class, if you want to do well, you better have a good statistic to back it up. So some of these proponents of these claims would probably fail Professor Bustamante's course. If you look at the statistics of voter fraud, which is the main basis for these voter ID laws, what is the statistic? Out of over 1 billion ballots cast since 2000, there are only 14 credible incidents of voter fraud. 14 out of 1 billion. So obviously, that's a minute number. If anything, that's essentially zero. Obviously, it's not. But 14 votes in a nation of over 300 million is not going to change much. So obviously, these claims are not factually or empirically based. They are only used as a political tool and vehicle to alienate key portions of the Democratic Party, to thereby mute the Latino community and the African American community in preventing their voice to be heard in the government. So for instance, even Representative Glenn Grothman, who is a Republican, I can't remember from which state, but he's a congressman, he actually admitted that voter ID restrictions were set in place in order to help benefit himself and also other representatives in the House that overwhelmingly tended to be Republican. And these ID laws obviously thereby narrowing their focus to ethnic and racial categories, or they're tending to focus on ethnic and racial populations that would therefore have a decreased presence at the polls. Oh, perfect. So obviously, this is a big structural problem that the Latino community and African American community will be facing now, as well as in the future of the political atmosphere of the United States. But one key thing to keep in mind, when I stated earlier, there are two major driving forces behind Latino interests. One is their growing numbers, and two is understanding that education and public services are crucial for their future. And when you look at the statistics of the United States right now, you'll see that despite these barriers, changes will be instituted and be coming. Why? Because Pew Research states that 1 in 3, or 17.9 million of the nation's population of Latinos is younger than 18. And 1 in 4, or 14.6 million of all Latinos are millennials. This is a huge, huge swell of Latinos that will be entering into the political dialogue and atmosphere. And obviously, these Latinos are going to be seeing and understanding what certain people that are in the White House are talking about their community and how they're being represented in the media, and will therefore, in my opinion, have an increased stake at going to the polls, regardless of whatever barriers there exist, to make sure that their voices are heard. And in fact, 94% of all Latinos under the age of 18 are born in the United States. So obviously, in the media in the United States, there's a huge focus on the undocumented community, on DACA, which, when you think about the numbers, there's a huge amount of DACA students, but 94% of the entire young Latino community is documented, by being born in the United States, are therefore citizens and therefore have the right to vote. So it would be on the onus on these 94% to help the other 6%. And by showing up to the polls, by showing up to the election, to allow their voices to be heard, that will be a huge political power that they could influence the entire political arena and spectrum. And this is a huge statistic because it's the most significant indicator of the future power that Latinos will have. To the extent, obviously, that they register, vote, and vote as a bloc. But with their alienation, my entire thesis rests upon the idea that they will be witnessing what is being stated about their community, about their parents, about their own brothers and sisters, and will vote overwhelmingly Democratic. So just as Prop 187 served as a catalyst to bolster Latino support in California, my thesis and argument is that the election of Donald Trump and everything that's happening will have an increased awareness within the Latino community, specifically in the young Latino community, obviously older Latinos as well, and will motivate them to vote overwhelmingly Democratic in crucial states that are battleground states, thereby facilitating the Electoral College to overwhelmingly swing to the Democrats. And the Democrats will most likely have an inborn advantage in terms of the Electoral College. And in terms of understanding this, we would have to break down the statistics of certain states that allowed for his win, which I will do in one moment. So if you look at the demographics, roughly 800,000 US-born Hispanics or Latinos enter adulthood each year, turning 18, thereby allowing themselves to vote. And in the coming decades, that number is going to go to over 1 million. With 50 And obviously, when people talk about the Latino community, oh, well, they're in California, they're in Texas, like that's mostly where their presence is going to be felt. But other than that, not really elsewhere. But if you look at the actual statistics, 52% of the Latino community is outside of California and Texas. And crucially, many exist in key battleground states. So as I stated before, there are similarities between the campaign of Pete Wilson and of Donald Trump. You can kind of see this through it's a hallmark of my entire paper. So you can see that characterizing Latinos as rapists, calling them Miss Housekeeping, chanting "Build that wall," are similar to Prop 187 and how Latinos were characterized under Pete Wilson. But my argument is that the tensions are actually greater now because it's on a national basis and it's on a national level. Further, Trump is being held up as a sort of poster child of the neo-Nazi movement. And I'm not trying to state that anybody that does support Donald Trump is a Nazi or is, a fascist or anything. But nonetheless, this fringe portion of the Republican Party is getting an increased presence on social media, in the media itself, and is being strongly correlated to Trump through his rhetoric. And at the same time, some of these fringe movements are gaining validation through his own statements and opinions of people that are othered about the Black community and the Latino community. If you look at Richard Spencer, I'm not sure how many of you know who he is. He's actually one of the leaders of the alt-right movement, which is the alternative right, which is how essentially neo-Nazis are trying to brand themselves currently. And at several of his political rallies, there was one that he stated, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory," and referred to Black political machines and Latino housekeepers. And these were strong correlations with Nazi Germany, right? The hail Trump, hail Hitler. You can see how closely marked this is. And Spencer himself stated that, quote, "America was until this last generation a white country, designed for ourselves and our posterity. It is our creation and our inheritance, and it belongs to us," end quote. You can see that in this us, it's not an inclusive us. He does not include the entire United States, every group that makes up the wonderful conglomeration of the American people. He has a very small and narrow scope of what he means by us when he says this country is for us, for Caucasians, for whites, which it certainly is for whites, but it's also for Latinos and for African Americans. And the question is not or, it's always and. So with Trump, we can see this fierce resentment of non-whites emboldened through his actions. And I argue that Trump winning, these opinions are being validated. And as I stated before, I'm not stating, and I do want to make sure that I state this, not all Trump supporters are neo-fascists or Nazis or whatever, but fringe portions are and are allowing himself to be emboldened in stating more and more xenophobic, racist, go on and on kind of statements. So, as I stated before, the underlying racial element of this is what, for whites, allowed them to vote crucially in the Midwest because of the idea that opportunities were being taken away from them, even though empirically it's not really the case. So if we look at the numbers of those that actually voted for Trump, 2/3 of non-college educated whites backed Trump. 28% voted Clinton. That's a 39% advantage. And his margin among non-college educated whites is the largest among any candidate in exit polls since 1980. So this is a huge motivating factor. His xenophobia. His simple solution to the problems of America is not that, oh, this is a structural problem. Oh, they're Latinos, that's it. Or, oh, it's the African Americans, that's it. A lot of people were able to buy into this simple explanation that he offered. So whites with a college degree, Trump crucially won 49% to 45%. And white non-Hispanic voters preferred Trump to Clinton by 21 percentage points, 58% to 37%. So, and if you look also at the impact of this election right after, if you consult the Southern Poverty Law Center, between the day of the election and November 14th, so the day of the election was November 8th, November 14th, just a few days after, there were a collected 437 reports of hateful discrimination and harassment. And overwhelmingly, practically all, but overwhelmingly, this was felt by Latinos and African Americans who bore the brunt of these heinous acts. And these are only the ones that are reported. There were I can attest that there were more than just 437 because I personally experienced one on campus. So as a catalyst of all this that's happening, all of this discrimination that is being fueled and supported by the Trump administration, that is being characterized by the alt-right movement, I'm arguing that this catalyst of political mobilization will further allow Latinos to identify with the Democratic Party and will give them an increased incentive to show up to the polls, thereby negating a lot of their low voter turnout. I'm not stating every Latino will show up, but I'm arguing more, especially among the young, will turn out. And obviously, they will be voting Democratic in views that they will need to be protecting themselves, their families, their children, their parents, their economic futures. So if you're looking at what gave Trump the election, essentially, right? I was talking about these battleground states, the huge system of the American political system that facilitates the election of a president is boiled down to the college, right? The electoral college. And there were certain states that obviously always vote Democratic, California, New York, and there's ones that always vote Republican, Alabama, Mississippi, etc. But what determines who wins are these battleground states. And crucially, the states that facilitated Trump's win was Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Obviously, Michigan and Wisconsin tend to be a little bit more Democratic, but nonetheless, this political cycle, they actually voted Republican. And if you're looking at Pew Research, we can analyze the data of these states to get an idea of what will be happening in the future. So in Michigan, the Latino population has grown to 477,000, thereby making up 231,000 of the eligible voters, a total of 3% of the eligible voters in Michigan. Now, obviously, that doesn't sound like a lot, and in actuality, it's not. It's only 3%. But how much did he lose by? 10,000 votes. If you were able to increase the participation of Latinos in this state, in Michigan, 231,000, obviously a good portion, a certain portion of that did show up. But if you were able to get into the 80-90% range of Latinos showing up in Michigan, that would have given the election to Clinton in that state, or to Democrats in the future if it's boiled down to an election like this. Wisconsin, the Latino population is 370,000, with 156,000 serving as eligible voters. Again, it's only 4% of the state's eligible voters. But Clinton only lost by 23,000 votes. Pennsylvania, there is a vibrant Latino community in Pennsylvania, 834,000, with 440,000 Latinos who are eligible to vote. Only 5% of the total eligible voters, but in Pennsylvania, he only lost by 44,000. She only lost by 44,000. And finally, crown jewel, if you'll allow me to state, that the Democrats will have in the future. The one thing that I strongly argue will be a huge game changer in political elections for the presidency will be Florida. There are 1,795,000 Latinos, which, and of the Latinos that are registered to vote, 15.7% of them are active. So that's 12 million active voters in 2016, whereas they were only 10.7% of registered voters only 10 years ago in 2006. If you add this impressive statistic to the fact that there are 2.6 million Hispanic Latinos that are eligible to vote in Florida, and if they show up and mobilize at the polls, Florida is going to be like California. It'll be overwhelmingly Democratic, at least in terms of the presidential campaigns, and increased populations in southern Florida and even central Florida that will be voting for congressmen and other crucial aspects in the local arena. So the 2016 election, obviously this was a lot to kind of go through. But if you look at the demographic trends above, or stated previously, and if you keep in mind all that's happening in the political arena, Democrats have a wonderful opportunity to place these states in their firm grasp for future presidential cycles, and also to start picking up seats in the Congress. The Latino vote will possibly be lost for the Republicans for the next future political cycles if they don't change their strategy and abandon or dump Trump. The future of the country is in the hands of Latinos, whether or not the Republican Party wants to accept it or not. So ultimately, because Latinos are intrinsically part of the future, they will be intrinsically part of the dialogue and will be, therefore, determining the future of America. And if we study recent pasts, such as Prop 187 with Pete Wilson, we can understand that a tactic of alienating Latinos is probably one of the worst political strategies that you could come up with. Effective for the short term, for sure, but for the long term, it's no way to govern the country, and it's no way any country should govern itself. You should never want to discriminate against any portion of your society, not least of all the one that's going to be voting for your elections in the future. So obviously these Latinos will be voting, and the path to making America great again will not be through this exclusion, but through the incorporation of the Latino community, African American community, and all communities in the United States. And that is how we'll make America great again. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was a very well-informed, good research. Perdón, este fue un trabajo muy bien logrado, bien investigado, con una gran riqueza de información y de análisis. O sea que de aquí vamos a salir todos convencidos de que vamos a votar por ti un día de estos. Y pues en realidad este ha sido, aunque es solamente una muestra de cómo se hace el trabajo académico de los estudiantes de alto nivel, como los que acabamos de escuchar. Esto pues es algo que ojalá y que sirva para una información mayor, para animar un proceso de internacionalización que debemos de mantener en nuestras actividades académicas en el Colegio de la Frontera Norte, y esto pues es una buena muestra, y les agradezco a los dos, sobre todo a Juliana, que está con la maleta lista para irse a Italia. Mañana sale a Europa. te deseamos muy buena suerte. No te vayas a quedar por allá, por favor. No hagas caso de los italianos que te digan que tienes ojos muy bonitos como italiana. Y esperamos de regreso. Muchas gracias. De acuerdo con el programa, se supone que yo debo abrir el foro por si hay alguien que tenga alguna pregunta, observación, comentario. Hasta ahí. ¿Sí? Araceli.
Sí, bueno, felicitarlos por las presentaciones. Felicitarlos por sus presentaciones. Quizá me perdí en la primera presentación, pero no creo haber escuchado nada de las ciudades santuario o el estado santuario que es California, tampoco en la segunda presentación, pero sí me encantaría escuchar las opiniones de ambos al respecto.
¿Qué opinan de los? Ya escucharon.
Oh, well, to begin, I would probably say that sanctuary cities, specifically, and states, specifically with, it's a very complicated question just because we're navigating territory right now that has not really been navigated before. We're not really sure, I'm not really sure how the federal government will be able to institute all of its policies on the states without the state, like California declaring states' rights and stating that, you know, this is out of the hands of the federal government, off of Trump, etc. I personally I hope that sanctuary cities will continue, and I do believe that they will, just because of the force of California in and of itself. 1 in 8 Americans, I believe, is in California, so that's a huge majority of the population of the country, period. And in addition, California does have a lot of resources at its disposal to continue to permit itself as a sanctuary state and continue sanctuary cities. Even if, the main strategy I would see the federal government using against California would be stating that we're not going to continue to give funds, or we're going to restrict the amount of money that would be entering California from the federal government. But I do believe that a lot of California policymakers and legislators, that for them, it's something that it's easy to bypass, to set aside, because of the economic stability of California and the fact that California is overly democratic and does want to protect these crucial citizens of the country. Whether or not the federal government refers to them as citizens, these crucial persons within the country.
Yeah, jumping off of what Greg said, you know, what he highlighted in his presentation, there's a huge power in California with the lawmakers, with the people, the very people themselves. I do see, you know, if the federal government does decide, you know, uncertainty if they do decide to come after California and places sanctuary cities, I do see not only the lawmakers, but the people rising up themselves and saying, you know, come at me, you know, protests and the power of the people. I do see it, you know, as Greg inspired us and gave us hope. We see it every day. I am inspired by the people and think that there will be a huge pushback, and I don't think sanctuary cities will be going anywhere. That's my opinion.
Yo nada más quisiera agregar una pequeña nota de pesimismo al escenario optimista de nuestros invitados, estudiantes, y es de que, número uno, la popularidad de Trump ha bajado, pero es aún bastante superior a 1/3 del total del electorado. Esto es algo muy importante, de que uno se sorprende teniendo un sesgo en la evaluación de lo que él está haciendo, se sorprende de que no sea más bajo, pero A mí lo que me sorprende es de que se haya sostenido a un cercano al 40% de popularidad. A mí lo que más me preocupa es los seguidores de Trump, o sea, aquellos cientos de miles de americanos que piensan igual que él y que no van a dejar de pensar igual que él cuando Trump desaparezca. Se van a quedar ahí y esto va a ser uno de los elementos que permiten pensar en escenarios ominosos para las minorías en general y para nuestra gente en particular. Gracias, y eso es todo. Gracias por su atención y que tengan buen viaje.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Good job. Well done.